Hello and welcome to another episode of the 50 Years of Coptic History in Australia series. I'm Bishop Angaelos. Today I'm joined by His Grace Bishop Angaelos of the Diocese of London. He's also one of our own from here in Sydney. Welcome, Your Grace.
I'm sure it's good to be with you.
We'll jump straight into it. Let's start at the very beginning. When did your family migrate to Australia and what are your earliest memories after arriving here?
So my father migrated in 1971 and we followed him as a family in 1973. And my earliest memories are living in Dulwich, going to St Mary's Church in Sydenham, and then going to various schools, primary school and secondary school. Struggling a bit with language at the beginning. I was only 5 when I came, so thankfully at that age, one picks up very quickly. But other than that, just wonderful memories, really.
What was it like growing up at arguably the spiritual home of the Coptic Church, Sydenham, St Mary's Church in Sydenham?
It was wonderful. It was a beehive activity. It was very much home. We were there from early on Sunday morning all through, and then as we got older, there were things on Friday night as we started a youth meeting, things during the week. It really did become a larger community and a larger family. And I've made friends there that I still have. A certain person who's very close to you, who you also know, and other people like His Grace Ambassador, Abuna Mauritius, many others who were just this one group with us. And we still have the relationships till today, and we still have the bonds that were built in that church.
What are some of your fondest memories?
Oh, there's so many of them. I suppose one of the fondest is when I used to, as a servant, go out on the Sunday school bus and sit next to the driver, and that was my first service. I loved doing it. To go around, pick children up, drop them off. It was just such a wonderful thing to do, to be able to serve even at a young age, and to have that responsibility and to be given that sense of responsibility as well.
You were mentioning your friends, Bishop Suriel and Father Mauritius earlier.
And Sam Basilis.
And Sam Basilis. Tell us a bit about that friendship.
It was a very normal friendship that, people have as young men growing up, as adolescents, as teenagers. We knew each other. We would go out together. We would have days out. We'd serve together. We'd visit each other. We would have our visits to Victoria Eros on days when we weren't fasting. We would go and play squash. All of these wonderful things.
Are you surprised at how many of you entered the monastery?
I think Sam is surprised how many of us entered the monastery. No one ever saw that coming. I know that as I left, the only one other than my family and a handful of others who knew that I was going to enter the monastery was Ambassador, because he had the same leanings and he felt the same way. So we had spoken before I left. But of course, it's interesting that not only did so many become monks, but so many of the people I grew up with became priests. Like Abuna Matthew, Abuna Antonios, and so many others as well.
It's like there's something in the water about Sydenham in the early days.
Well, it was the only church, and it was the whole community. Yeah. And it was wonderful to see that happen. I was then involved at a step. So those 4 of us, Ambassador Abuna Mauritius, Sam, and myself, were tasked with starting the first ever youth meeting by the then parish priest Abuna Theodosius. And we were given full responsibility and the ability to set up and do what we thought was right. And then over time, a similar youth meeting was going to be set up at St Mark's, and Magdi Kalada at the time asked me to go and help with that, and so established a youth meeting there. We also used to serve across churches. We had wonderful friends like Abuna Shnuda Mansour, who was at St George at the time with Sam, and so many people who were just across the churches, but we all had relationships, because when I left, there were, I think, only 5 churches in Sydney. So even that huge number was distributed over 5 churches.
As we know, Sydenham was demolished in May 2017, and I know you spoke out in favour of keeping the building. What are your thoughts since it was demolished?
I mean, it's a reality of life. Life moves. We don't hold on to bricks and mortar. Yeah. It would have been nice to have kept it, but you know, with a tradition like ours and a history like ours of 2,000 years, we haven't really held on to much except what's really important. We've held on to our faith, we've held on to our tradition, we've held on to our relationships. And the proof is it was demolished. It was a shame that it was demolished, but the relationships live on, the memories live on. That church will always be in our hearts and our minds.
Yeah. Now, I think all 4 of you might have headed to Egypt on the first ever youth trip at the end of 1985. What was it like meeting Pope Shenouda III for your first time, or what was that like?
It was wonderful. We travelled with Amba Daniel, who was then Abuna Daniel Antoni, and it was the first youth trip from Australia to Egypt. It was the first time any of us had met the Pope, or at least I had met the Pope. I'm not sure about others. We spent a long time at the monastery, and I remember sitting with His Holiness as a group and sharing his wisdom and talking about lots of things. It was a bonding experience, and again, that group that went on that trip, we still, every time we meet, and I come once a year, and it's, you know, 30 years later, and we're still remembering that trip. So it did have that impact on us.
Your enthronement as the Bishop of London in 2017, Bishop Surial shared a story about how the 2 of you spoke about going into the monastic life. How much of that original conversation do you remember? Oh,
all of it. I remember where we were sitting and when we met, because it was over a few months where I felt his leanings, and so I opened up to him that's what I was planning on doing, and then he opened up as well. And it was very normal for us to be speaking about it, and it was very encouraging to be able to be so open.
Who was the biggest influence in helping you make the decision to go to the monastery?
God. But I suppose you'd expect that.
Yeah.
As far as we're concerned, a monastic calling is a calling. I don't think I was inspired by any particular figure to go to the monastery. It was just a real calling of wanting to dedicate my life to God. But one thing that I do remember is in 1985, at some stage, or even earlier, during one of my trips to Egypt, having gone with my cousin to the monastery of St. Bishoy and walking in through the front door and having a monk on a tractor wave at me and say hello. And for some reason that really impacted me. And for some reason that's why I felt this connection with St. Bishoy Monastery in particular. And it's something small like that. And it shows how kindness generally is so important. He didn't think twice about waving at 2 teenagers who were, you know, walking into the monastery. Yeah. But it impacted me.
It's those little things.
Yeah.
Now, you were on the second youth trip to Egypt in 1989, but this time you didn't come back home. Can you elaborate on to why?
Yes, well, that's when I decided to enter the monastery, but no one knew, so I went on the trip. I saw everyone off at the airport and then went into the monastery. So it was interesting that that was my farewell to the community. I left there. I spent this time of pilgrimage with people I knew, and then farewelled them all and entered the monastery. And that was at the beginning of 1990.
You would have been still very young at the time. How old were you?
I was 22.
22. And I imagine leaving your family and friends behind, it would have been very difficult for them and yourself at the start?
It's going to sound horrible, but I don't think it was difficult for me, because I think I went straight into monastic life. Yeah. I've never, taking those steps, one never looks back. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to assess, you're supposed to evaluate, of course, to be careful. But I never felt that I had lost anything. In actual fact, I felt I'd gained. Yeah. And the beautiful thing is, I haven't lost those relationships. 30 years on, I still have the relationships with those people, with the community, and so, we know God's faithful when He says that no one gives anything up until he or she receives multiples of it. Then I think that is true.
Your Grace, it's been a pleasure having you here in Sydney again, back home, and here in the studio as always. May God continue to bless your service and ministry in the UK and overseas, and we hope to see you back here again at the next milestone of the Coptic Church in Australia.